the Beyond Sleep Training podcast, a podcast dedicated to sharing real tales of how people have managed sleep in their family outside of sleep training culture. Because sleep looks different with a baby in the house, and because every family is different, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to take. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is being recorded, the Kalkadoon people. I pay my respects to the elders of this nation and the many other nations our guests reside in from the past, present and emerging. We honour Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, water and seas, as well as their rich contributions to society, including the birthing and nurturing of children. Welcome back to the Beyond Sleep Training podcast. This week, we're welcoming back the wonderful Leah De Shay. If you haven't listened to last week's episode, we heard part one of Leah's story and how her family, or how she came to be handling sleep in her family. And this week, we're looking forward to hearing how that looked when she actually welcomed her own babes to the fold. So welcome back, Leah.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here again.
So tell me, when we finished the last episode, we were just getting to the part when you were welcoming your first babe, who you said is now 10 years old. Is that right?
She's almost 10. She's going to be 10 very soon. Yep.
So while you were pregnant with her, did you have an idea of how you wanted to approach sleep with your family?
I'm not sure that my idea was conscious. And if anybody's listened to the previous episode, we're talking about defaults, which is just like not even really having an awareness of how much the customs that you grew up with are affecting your expectations and your subconscious behavior, right? So I think for me, there was no conscious, and this is an extremely common phenomenon, so it's good for everybody to think about. There was no conscious, like, me sitting down and looking at anything that had happened in my childhood or anything that I was accustomed to and conceptualizing like, oh, this is how I was raised. I should see what other people have done with their children for sleep. Like, that process absolutely did not happen during my first pregnancy. And I think it's normal that it doesn't happen for most. I think people come into it with assumptions, not even necessarily processing that they are assumptions. You know what I mean? And so I was very stereotypical in that sense. Like, I was no different than most of the patients I would ever see, like, in the future with my first baby. So no, there was nothing conscious that happened.
So were you thinking, so you were planning to breastfeed and co-sleep with her?
I was, because that was the norm in my family. That's right.
Yeah. Excellent. And so when she came along, how did you find that immediate postpartum?
So this is where things, I think, get really fascinating. And I hope this speaks to some people, because it was so unexpected for everyone involved. So I actually had a really extraordinarily difficult time co-sleeping. And it was heartbreaking for me, because in my family, that was like a marker of being a good mother.
It's how things were done, kind of. It's like how things were done. With cot sleeping.
Correct. And so this isn't a statement on what is right or what is not right, because especially now as a provider, what is right is whatever situation is safe and fulfilling, that accomplishes and meets the developmental and, social, emotional needs of the baby. And then the provider, for me, is what's right. And so I can always advise.
It's got to.
Yeah, it has to work, because if you can't do it, it won't work. Like, that's
sustainability, people. They're not babies for a day.
Absolutely. And so, of course, if it's harmful, I'm just, to be extremely straightforward. I do not work with families who are practicing cry it out. I don't shame them. I release them if they have to work with someone else. But that's a boundary for me, because that there is, in the risk benefit ratio arena, there is only harm on a research level. So I have a responsibility as a clinician and a provider to be extremely upfront about that. And it doesn't mean that I think that I understand why people resort to it. Truly. I'm like, when we get into, I really do. I have my child who is autistic, had extraordinary colic I truly understand the amount of exhaustion and exacerbation that a parent gets to, where they are so desperate for sleep and relief that you're kind of like, dude, kid, if I don't get any more sleep, neither one of us is going to survive. So if you're going to lay, no, truly, like, and this is just me being empathic. Like, I understand where you're like, I'm just going to have to put you down in this crib and you're going to have to cry, because if I don't go to sleep, I'm going to die on the road to work tomorrow, and then you won't have a parent. So, you know, a lot of parents are just doing that calculation inside their mind. Those families I absolutely will work with, because I know how to do risk reduction for them. It's families who have a night nurse and a doula and a mom in the house and all of the rest of that, and they still choose to do cry it out. I'm not their doula, you know, I'm not for you. You've got other influences that are apparently really strong that are priorities in your life. And while I'm not going to judge you, like, I'm not the right person to support you. You know what I mean?
You don't have to be a part of it.
Correct. People who are desperate and they are resorting to cry it out of a sense of just inability to find any other option, and truly going days without sleep and all the rest of that. I am their doula. I absolutely can help you. Right. And so my experiences reflect, being really disoriented and coming face to face with feeling like I didn't measure up, like, to my mother and my aunts, and my grandmothers. So I had D-Mer, which is dysphoric milk ejection reflex. Yep. And then I had aversion once the kids got teeth. Yeah. I got all the things. And it was so heartbreaking for me, because those things, no one in my family knew about that. So when I went to what I thought were going to be my support systems to seek help, they were all sort of like, oh God, what's wrong with you? Like, you should see a doctor about that. Yeah.
That's
brutal. So it is. And this is not a remark against my mother. Like, nobody berated me. You know what I mean? Like, this is not, and that does happen. No. Correct.
Yeah. It fell outside their range of reference.
Absolutely. And I gained an immediate sense of exclusion. It was extremely jarring for me from an identity standpoint, from a relationship standpoint. So my experience was disorienting, to be honest, because I planned to do these things. And, you know, at that point, that was in 2010, when I got pregnant in 2011, end of 2010. She was born in 2011. And so at that point, all of these things were just sort of like starting to come into trend, that you were even discussing them, right? And they were, at the time, Fed is Best was not really out yet. And so breast is best was still a thing that people were saying. And it was like, is it safe to sleep with? And like, is it extreme or is it better? That's when all of the, sort of the conversations were happening about 10, 11 years ago. And I was just heartbroken. I really felt like something was wrong with me, mentally, physically, and emotionally.
Did you find some support, like obviously outside of family, but was there anyone?
You know, it took years. It wasn't until she was in preschool that I was able to find social support. And so a huge part of my secondary wave in my career has been creating space for support and being an assertive, sometimes aggressive advocate against the shaming that happens among my colleagues in the community for women who deal with this. I really have no tolerance for my colleagues.
Fair enough too.
Yeah, because it's not helping. What are you helping? What are you helping?
And what's the plan? Like what about these people?
Right.
Where's the support there? Correct.
It's different if you say this is out of my scope and this is out of my comfort level as a provider. I respect that. But a lot of amongst the IBCLC and doula circles, there's a lot of Madonna complex collectively that's going on with them, where being an acceptable woman is still limited to your ability to materialize all of these idealistic, stereotypical things about femininity, right? And so it led me to be way more assertive in being a feminist and just really lean into advocacy. I mentioned that I was doing STD and breastfeeding research. And so I was already in arenas where I was dealing with people who were parents, but also were, their lives involve a lot of taboo issues that other people don't want to talk about. Sex work, LGBTQ communities, which now like is more normalized, but 10 or 15 years ago, it still was not. Like when we were in college, it still wasn't like, it was normalized in the sense of that we all knew it existed, but there wasn't a lot of integration, certainly not in care. So I sort of already had a primer of like being there for the underdog and identifying with that dynamic, if that makes sense. But I think going through the experience of thinking that, oh, like this is all just going to come naturally to me, right? because it is natural to me, right? Like hypothetically in my mind, and then finding out that your mind and your body are together, but they are not one and the same. And I think a huge part of becoming a mother is navigating that. And it can be so jarring for some of us, right? When everything doesn't line up.
Well, it's part of the control side of things, isn't it?
It is.
Kind of just the opinion of if you just work at something or you decide this is how it's going to be, you can make it so.
Correct.
And it's just not like that when you have a babe. Not. It's not like that at all. So tell us so obviously you had a rough time breastfeeding. Did you actually? So I had, and this is, we know now in research, we don't know which is coming first, the chicken or the egg, and correlation is not causation, but there isn't a correlation between extremely high supply and D-Mer. And that's, again, different podcasts for like biology and to talk about the dopamine upcycle and all of the rest of that, why that might be the case. So I had that was another thing that was alienating, because on the outside, like I pumped extremely easily, like I expressed easily. I just had so much milk everywhere. And so it didn't leave me a lot of space to find support, because what everybody was seeing was, oh, you have a great big fat baby, breastfeeding must be going great. Oh, wow, you have a freezer full of milk. And I was like, yes. And I am miserable because right now I'm at the behest of my breasts, right? I have no control over this. This isn't about what I want to be doing. Like, I got into that runaway train of like, my breasts are always full and I'm extremely uncomfortable and I have D-Mer. So every time I have a letdown, I feel miserable and it's happening all the time. So I've got to empty my boobs and I have to feed this baby more, but God, I hate feeding this baby. Like it really can get you into a terrible place. And unless you've had the experience, it's kind of, even when you have the experience, it's not easy to understand because it's not a logical experience. It's not an experience that makes sense, right? But it is how it is. Like that. Yeah. That was how it felt, and it was how you experienced it. So, do you think that played into how did your relationship with Babe look then? Like, if you're finding this so damn frustrating and miserable, how are you feeling with Babe?
I think my saving grace that allowed me to cope in a way that did not affect her negatively. And I feel like because, she's a decade old, I can say that with some confidence. She still has the rest of her life ahead of her. Maybe she'll end up on the couch in 10 years about like breastfeeding nightmares or something like that. But right now, she seems to be...
She's doing right now.
Right. She seems to be a really well-adjusted, incredibly bright, really cool kid. So I think she's okay. The one saving grace of my default culture having been very child-centered was that I was able to separate what the war that I felt was going on with my body from my relationship with my child. And that's not something I am taking credit for. I want to be really clear, because I definitely ended up with depression. With maternal depression specifically, because why wouldn't I? I was exhausted. I was such a light sleeper that every time she breathed differently, I was wide awake, which I later learned was anxiety. So it ended up, my co-sleeping issues ended up being from anxiety that had been undiagnosed for years. And I had no idea about, but they flared up so high that I got OCD symptoms. And so I just had overlapping things. And, the less you sleep is the worse anything becomes. So even if you don't have mental health issues, you're gonna, if you're not sleeping for a long time.
And roundabouts.
Right. Yeah. So by the time she was about 7 months old, I knew I needed help, and I was trying to go back to work. And that's when I actually got into a car accident the second day I went back to work because I was so exhausted. And my eyes were wide open, but I was not awake. Like I woke up when I felt the impact, even though my eyes were open, because I would describe the experience now as hallucinating, not in the way that happens when you're in drugs, but in what your brain does when you're that fatigued for that long.
Separate from reality.
Yeah. And the remarkable thing was, even when she was in care and when she was babysat, then I couldn't even get to sleep. So when I tried to co-sleep, I could sleep. I was just constantly waking. But when she was not there and someone else was taking care of her, I couldn't sleep at all. And that was sort of the trigger, like, ding, this isn't actually about the co-sleeping or the baby or the breastfeeding. There's something else going on inside your head for which all of this is a trigger. And it just ended up being anxiety. So my takeaway from that is that in the previous episode, when I talk about giving ourselves space, like as women, I think there's such a lack of support and sometimes just a spirit of just pushing things aside, as women, as we're getting older. And that's okay. Like, we don't need to blame ourselves for that. Society is what it is. Our cultures are what they are. And, you can't blame yourself for being a product of however you grew up. But don't ignore like your own pain. You know what I mean? Like at some point during the process, there's so much pressure during the new period to adjust that you can't even escape. That's necessary in order for you to take care of your kid. That if there are things in your life that have always been things that you needed support over, and you've told yourself, oh, it's not a big deal, or, like, I don't really want to bother people with that, or this is just me, all of the things that we tell ourselves, like push things inside into the back of your mind. Don't be surprised if it comes to the front. And when it does, like, get some help.
Absolutely.
So I found help with the therapist. I
was about to ask you that. I was like, who did you see? And so how old was baby when you actually were able to get you some help? About 7 to 8 months. Yeah. Yeah. It seems to be a really common trend, hey? Like I was in the 6 to 7 month, but it took me to break before I did that. But yeah, it seems to be really common. Like it's like you think you're going to outrun that newborn period. Correct. And then you kind of stretch it a bit further. And then when it's still not okay, it's like, hang on a sec. Right. And it's okay. Like it would be so brilliant if people were able to get that support they needed much earlier before you hit that full-blown breakdown exhaustion. Because it's hard to come back from, isn't it? Because you're still mothering. You've still got this kid who needs you. You're always working against a deficit. You end up working against a deficit for years. Yeah. It's very hard to come back. And I feel like, did you find then with your second, third and fourth babe that you were able to address that before it became such a heavy deficit, or did you find that it was still a challenge? No. So that's a wonderful reflection also. So I got help. I had a wonderful therapist. It is important to note though, in me saying that I have, and so I'm separating these two things for a reason. I think, I fully believe that mental health issues are medical clinical issues. I am, there are communities that really have a reticence against medication. And on a social standpoint and from an intersectional standpoint, I understand where a lot of those things come from. However, I don't indulge like demonizing people seeking pharmacological treatment. You know what I mean? Like whatever is safe and available to you is what you should use to find balance for yourself. Absolutely. And especially for some people, that can be the difference between able to have success in therapy or not. Because absolutely, definitely. It can provide that space you need to be able to actually get properly well. My thing would be, as someone who's been through that kind of challenge as well, would be that I wouldn't rely only on medication. Correct. Like if that were the only thing you're doing, it's probably not going to be you getting really well. No, but you will form a dependency, but you won't have any sort of solutions that
that give you progress. So you just stay static,
and
right?
Like,
you'll get into a holding pattern, but you won't undo whatever is causing the issue. I completely agree. So pharmacological actually did not end up working for me, which was sort of upsetting at first, but I had a wonderful therapist. And so I was able to go through like cognitive behavioral therapy, and it was really, really helpful for me. With that in mind, and so trigger warning for anybody who's coming up, I ended up having to face and deal with some traumatic things that had happened to me outside of my family that involved abuse. And I realized that I had been in a marriage that was abusive. I'm leaving space to think about that also because, like, the way I said it was on purpose. I realized that that marriage that I was in was abusive. The statements where we just talked about, where it was a very short marriage. He was a police officer. There's a lot of things going on also for another podcast. But because I had never even told my parents some of the things that had happened to me, not within my own household, right? And so because of shame and because of just lack of awareness and whatever else, there are things that I had never faced. So it all came to a peak when I had a child, because I was exhausted, right? Like I was also feeding into that, and I wasn't in a healthy situation, but I couldn't recognize so many of the things that were happening to me. I was continuing to internalize blame for them in myself. And going to therapy, my therapist was like, I'm sorry, what happened with your husband?
It's like, you're not taking that on. Like,
right.
That's not you.
No, she was like, whoa, let's back up. And so it really helped me unpack so many things that had gone on in my life. Also why I'm divorced, obviously. Thankfully, everybody does not leave their abusive relationships. And that's also a different conversation. And abuse is such a really bizarre, dark dynamic, on both sides for both people who are going through it. So no shame or judgment for other folks, but I have seen in the last 10 years as a provider, so many women who also had aha moments of like, oh my goodness, I'm experiencing emotional abuse, because they hear someone else talking about it and then they hear it, name it that way. And they're like, oh, it's not just my husband, like being a prick and making me feel terrible. Like this is a name. It is a thing. It has like,
it's been a lot of realizations in the community. The Me Too movement's made a massive shift in the way people are thinking.
So I separate those two things because, number one, you can be depressed and have anxiety and have OCD and be in a really extremely loving partnership. You can. And so I intentionally didn't include that in me talking about it at first, because I wanted people to know that, like, it's complicated, like sometimes both present at the same time. Sometimes people are in abusive relationships and they really, really lean into their mothering, and their mothering is like their outlet where they do great. And then at work is where they're experiencing extreme, disruption. It can be really different for everyone. It's such a difficult transition. But if there is anything latent that you have not had support for, like, get support for it. This is 100% my takeaway point for that. So in that relationship, the only way that I was able to resolve what was going on was by leaving. And that it's not for lack of trying. Like, I tried everything available to me, but as you also learn when you're parenting, like, you can't make anybody do anything, least of all your partner. And so I did everything I could do, and he was extremely unwilling to participate in any progress. That's putting it lightly, if not, directly aggressively opposing me at all times. So the only way for me to level my mental health and make sure that it wasn't affecting my child in a way that I thought her development was really going to be threatened was for me to put a boundary on that relationship. Again, I had a lot of support. My family's wonderful and they helped me with that. Everybody doesn't have that. And I know that, and that's terrible. And that's also like for a different conversation, but surely find someone, like a therapist. There are organizations, there is support available, even if it's not from the people who really should be giving it to you. You still should be able to find it.
Absolutely. And it's kind of, even if you're having little niggling thoughts of, oh, maybe I'll just give it a bit more time, that probably is a sure sign you should be seeking support now.
Absolutely. 100%. And that doesn't mean you can't give it more time, but give it more time while
with
you have support. Absolutely. 100%.
Agreed. It makes a massive difference.
Yes. So when I went into, there was a gap, obviously, of almost 5 years before I had my next kid. I got remarried to a man who I had known before my ex-husband, and we had been really good friends the entire time. He also was co-parenting, which for me, it wasn't necessarily like a need, but it ended up being so helpful because the capacity for someone else to understand and not judge and not question or necessarily be frustrated with dynamics that were part of my life. Hopefully less part of my life now also would, how that happens in the U.S. is the U.S. does not take domestic violence seriously, which is extraordinarily terrible. But for people who are listening outside of the United States, if you're like, why did you have any co-parenting? Yes, different conversation. The U.S. is a crazy place.
Australia's like trying to make grounds, but it's pretty disgraceful.
I've been watching the pages, and we definitely can't get into it right now, but my goodness.
Yeah, there's lots of room for improvement, let's say.
Definitely. I've seen. So when the next choices that I made, I was in therapy the entire time, which is definitely a privilege everyone doesn't have. And as an advocate now, I have channels. I'm connected enough that if people reach out to me and they're really serious and they want a therapist, and they have a lot of barriers, then I am happy to connect people. So I want to put that out there. I feel like that's a responsibility of mine. I had therapy. My husband currently had therapy also because I was like, I'm not marrying another man who hasn't gone through therapy. I don't care if you don't think anything's wrong with you. You have to go.
It's a requirement, buddy.
Absolutely. It's a prereq. So please finish it. And he was fine with that. But we discussed all of these things. And, he has a daughter who's 9. And they're friends. It's actually one of the reasons why we're together is because when they were like 1.5, they started some of their first full sentences were asking to play with the other. We were in a close social group. And so we ended up getting really close after our children got close, which is, kind of cute and whatever.
Like you were meant to be, hey?
Yeah.
Across again. Love that.
So he also came from a background where co-sleep was the norm and breastfeeding was the norm. But now I was able to reflect to him, like, I love this norm and it's a wonderful ideal, but I struggled with it. I need a partner who is willing to do these things, knowing that it does not serve me, like medically or mentally. Like I can't fulfill this need for my kids, but I still want it fulfilled. And when I've talked about this at conferences, and roundtables, it has really been a huge aha moment for partners of any gender. Because sometimes you're dealing with things in a marriage and it's really just a lack of understanding of different needs in the partner. Like just because both parents can't fulfill a need doesn't mean the child can't get their needs fulfilled.
It's a team effort. If it can be a team effort, it can be one. That is
absolutely. Cool. So I was just in charge of all of the feeding, whether it was breastfeeding or pumping or whatever was happening. And most of the time it was breastfeeding. But we came up with a system where I would breastfeed the baby. And because I was still awake, because I cannot sleep with my kids next to me, I would then give the baby to him when the baby was drowsy and almost asleep. And he co-slept with the kids. And I got a full night's sleep. And he, ironically, started sleeping better when he was co-sleeping.
It's a thing. It seems to really be like it either really has that impact on you or not. Definitely for me, like, wow. Although I did have the anxiety issues, but I found my second and third baby because I did it from the very beginning. Absolutely. Like, and I have very high sleep needs. Like I'm way on the high average of adult. And that was, sounds like we're pretty similar, your husband and I, for that part.
Yes. So, well, the good news is also, by my 4th child, I was able to co-sleep. And the first time I fell asleep and woke up, I say this because I feel like people need to hear this progress. Basically, my anxiety over the last 7 or 8 years that I've been together with my husband, and just in the course of probably just a lot of healing of everything that happened to me, you know, including my relationship with my ex and anything that precluded that had not necessarily been resolved or even confronted. In that process. And I think just having a partner that was willing to work with me without judgment and, you know, was flexible and, you know, let's just try all of the options that we can do that meet our needs and the baby's needs, that removed so much anxiety from me also. Yeah.
And you knew he had your back. Like, what was the harm in trying different things when you knew he had your back?
If it doesn't work and we won't do it anymore, you know, and there doesn't need to be great aggravation or anything about it. Like, let's just find our happy medium. But yeah, by the time my son was born, so by the time my third child was born, it was so emotional for me. My husband said he shed a few tears when it happened. I was basically breastfeeding my son. He was like 6 weeks old. And I fell asleep. And my husband said he came in the room and he was like, oh, because that wasn't my norm and it didn't happen. And so he said he just got in the bed, like he repositioned us, made sure, you know, the bedding and everything was safe.
Yeah.
And he made a comment to me and I sort of heard him. He said, Magnus is still here. Are you okay? And I like pushed him off. He said, I was like, stop touching me. Like I'm asleep. Like, leave me alone.
Busy.
Right. And I woke up the next morning and I had slept for 6 hours with my son next to me. He was a very, very fat, well-fed baby at this point. Like he tripled his weight by the time he was 8 weeks old. So he had what I'm about to say is not normal and like, don't make any judgments off of it. But the baby slept too. And so
yeah.
So he had no needs. He had no dietary needs for those 6 hours. So we both slept 6 straight hours and I just bawled when I woke up. I was like, wow. Did I just like co-sleep? Wow. I didn't know that was going to be able to happen. Then we started arguing over co-sleeping because he had started sleeping really well with the kids. And I was like, nope, no, thanks. I finally got this. Like, go away.
My turn, mate.
Yeah,
exactly. Oh, I love it. That's a beautiful story.
So
and
that's our long-term story. And we, you know, now we just gauge it over what's our work schedules. You know, whoever is working the earliest in the morning is the one that gets the primary self sleep as the parent, and whoever isn't is the one who puts the kids to bed. Our kids now all basically sleep on their own. I mean, obviously they wake up, there's sleep disruptions. And so we just alternate who's on for the night. And it just depends on our schedule. So if one of the kids wakes up and they can't sleep, then whatever parent is on that night is the one either who's, you know, going to co-sleep or put them back to sleep or whatever is happening. And can I just say it happens when your kids are still 10, like they're going to go through puberty again and their entire sleep cycle is going to change. So don't think my 10-year-old was the best sleeper. She was like the rock sleeper. And now she's the one who's most likely to be like, I can't sleep for various reasons in the middle of the night.
It is a thing though, as they get bigger, hey, like the, you know, nightmares or worried about something at school that they didn't get out before bedtime. You know, there's heaps of little things that come along. But I guess that's the thing. Like, I don't know about you, but I still like I said, I sleep a lot, but I still wake in the night to go have a wee or
of course, like, or to be thirsty. 39. It's ridiculous that we think that children shouldn't be able to do that. And you know, most people when you ask them, you don't even have to like berate them or anything. You just ask them, so how many times did you get up last night after you went to sleep? And most people will go ding, and it sort of hits them.
And it takes such a weight off waiting for that whole sleep through the night milestone. It's
absolutely.
Like, I don't even like, it's not even a thing. Like it may never happen. And you know what? We'll all be okay. Like that's not the thing I'll be waiting for. That is brilliant. I just love the actual transformation of having a partner who is fully there for you and your family, and being able to recognize where the other parent's at and be able to show that kind of flexibility with each other. And it's just that real trust and faith in the relationship that makes such a huge difference for you guys.
Huge difference. Yeah,
that is absolutely massive. Now, I'm just looking at time and I can't believe it. We're already up for another episode. I feel like we have at least another episode, if not two, in us.
Yes, I know definitely.
But before you finish up, would you have one more tip for us that we could share with our listeners?
This tip is actually for the non-birthing partners. And that is that, this is not anecdotal, although the anecdotes, in my practice certainly support it. From a research standpoint, the long-term success and ability for us to predict how prevalent depression will be in the birthing parent is greatly influenced by the rate of engagement of the partner. And I don't say that in a blaming way. I'm sure some people hear it that way. I'm saying it. There's so many men, especially, who once the baby is born, feel like they have no power over those first 2 years. You know what I mean? There's a huge sense. I constantly hear like feelings of helplessness, of not knowing what to do, feeling like you don't know how to make a positive impact. Partners make an enormous impact, and it's a cascading impact because you're impacting, your partner who's just given birth, who needs to recover, and God knows how many other things, depending on what commitments they have in their life, right? And come into their own, whatever decisions they're making, whether you're pumping, bottle feeding, breastfeeding, whatever you're doing. None of those things will be pleasant for anyone unless there is an equal level of compassion and empathy and engagement from the partner. And partners have 100% control over that, They do.
Do you reckon, is there a term you might know? Is putrescence a thing, like a term that's used?
It is a new thing that I've heard people
because I'm just thinking about it. Because I know when I was in matrescence, I really struggled with my husband's finding his feet because Absolutely. I had no freaking clue where I was, let alone being able to help him sort out his shit. And so it was a really, really messy time in our relationship. Whereas Absolutely. Whereas I found second and third baby, and it sounds like maybe this is why you and your second husband also had some luck, because you'd already kind of been there and started your matrescence and he'd started putrescence.
Yes.
That there was this actual recognition that, hang on a sec, or you can find your roles, but you had already started to find yourself to know what would feel right for you. Do you think that might be?
That made a huge difference, and it's a privilege everyone doesn't have. But I don't know if privilege is that's not the right way to describe it, because it came out of divorce. So.
Yes. But it's also that whole, isn't it it's rough that you have to be kind of lucky to be able to be in that kind of relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But actually, in reality, if we are honest, it is absolutely lucky now.
It is, unfortunately. Relatively speaking, it is. It should not be at all. It should be the default. But statistically and realistically and relatively speaking.
And
absolutely.
Talking practically, there is a lot of work to be done in this space. But I guess, once again, that comes back to our talk, when we were talking last episode, where it's giving yourselves time and space to also grow and learn as well, especially if you are actually in a worthwhile relationship. I'm not talking about relationships that are toxic and unhealthy, but in a worthwhile relationship. Like my husband and I, we were in a really healthy relationship, but wow.
And it can still be complete hell. It'll be some of the worst hell your relationship goes through.
We were so poles apart for so long because we were me particularly went so inwards. There was nothing left. So I think that's really important, like you say. And I think for people listening along, especially if you're still in the thick of your early days parenting, go easy with each other, but do understand that you will make an amazing team eventually. Give yourself some time to find your feet and find what feels right for both of you. Play to your strengths. So play to your strengths and just lean into compassion when all else fails.
I feel like among the attachment parenting community, I joke, but perhaps this isn't a joke, as a reproductive sociologist now, who I no longer only counsel, I very rarely only counsel one partner. I do collective counseling, and that's why I call my practice family doula, because I found that the only way that long-term progress takes hold is when I am supporting both people who are responsible for taking care of that child for this exact reason.
It helps get people on the same page.
100%.
Yeah. And the things we bring to parenthood, it can be poles apart. And you don't know what you don't know before you had that baby. You have no idea what your points of difference are going to be.
Right. So I try to insert in the interactions compassion and practicality and some rationality if the need is there. because I'm modeling. Do you know what I mean? And like, it's very intentional. You model that behavior. And sometimes you'll be with a partner and they'll tell me later, like, I've never seen them soften on this subject until you interacted with them. And then I realized, like, they just want to be understood. Like, they're not necessarily trying to oppose me, but they feel judged, you know, or they feel exiled or whatever else is happening.
Not heard.
Right. When we look at what we as advocates are suggesting that we practice in attachment parenting, like, we sort of need to practice attachment partnering, like, and it's not going to come naturally to you. I think that's the most important part. Like, it's not going to feel natural. You're going to have to look at this person in your mind, in your brain during conversations where you want to be like, what the hell is the matter with you? Like, if that's what you want to come out of your mouth. And sometimes maybe that still will, like, in certain conversations, it still might, but it needs to be followed up with the concept of curiosity, like, come from a place of wanting to understand truly. Maybe something is wrong with them, like physically or otherwise, but don't come from a place of criticism. Come from a place of, I desire to understand, you know, what the challenges are between us so that I can fix them, because that's how you approach your kids. And so this is not infantilization. This is not looking at your children and being like, they're smaller than me, they're so cute. This is, once we learn to respect children as individual adults from us, it makes more sense what I'm saying and practicing mutual compassion across all the relationships in your household. Do you know what I mean?
I was about to say compassion. That's what we're going for there, isn't it? Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And it's really powerful stuff. I'm so glad you brought the partners into that. Now, we're all out of time for this episode, but I feel like we're going to have to get you back again. Do you think you might have another episode with us later on, Leah?
Yes,
not today,
we
not
can do
Sunday.
it. Not today. Not today. Yeah. Later on, definitely. Yes.
It's been an absolute delight listening, and just such wise words, but also I love the reality of it. You can feel the warmth and the compassion that went into your story for yourself and all members of your family. So thank you so much for that. It was wonderful. All right. So thank you so much. And I'll drop all of your information into show notes for people if they're looking out for the family doula, so that we can keep these conversations going. Remember, please do share it around and comment and mention as much as you can, because as Leah said in our first episode, these kind of conversations are not algorithm friendly necessarily. So the organic growth and stretch is not really there. So let's play our part because these conversations are so important to families around the world. So thank you for coming on, Leah. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Look forward to doing it again.
I really hope you enjoyed the podcast today. The information we discussed was just that, information only. It is not specific advice. If you take any action following something you've heard from our show today, it is important to make sure you get professional advice about your unique situation before you proceed, whether that advice be legal, financial, accounting, medical, or any other advice. Please reach out to me if you do have any questions or if there's a topic you'd really like us to be covering. And if you know somebody who'd really benefit from listening to our podcast, please be sure to pass our name along. Also, check out our free peer support group, the Beyond Sleep Training Project, and our wonderful website, www.littlesparklers.org. If you'd like even more from the show, you can join us as a patron on Patreon, and you can find a link for that in our show notes. If listening is not really your jam, we also make sure we put full episode transcripts on our Little Sparklers website for you to also enjoy, and fully captioned YouTube videos as well on our Little Sparklers channel. So thanks again for listening today. We really enjoy bringing